I tried something different, so apologies if this doesn't work. I've tried to sketch out all of these things. I've taken a habit of sketchnoting notes, and when I had a chat with Dave and Mark about what I was going to talk about, I basically sketched out some of these things and then just kind of prettied it up a bit. So, and you're welcome to have these. They're going to be slightly difficult to reuse. It's a PDF, and it's got my picture all over them. That is supposed to be me. Someone made the point earlier that if I'd shaved this off, it probably wouldn't have been recognisable for me, but I do often look that surprised and shocked, given the state of local government communications, or just take communications out of the state of local government. I'm probably going to take about 30 minutes to just talk about, and well, realistically, just tell the story of communications within a local government context from where we are in Devon. Hopefully some of that might resonate with you. If not, I'm really sorry. But there's a lot of analogies, and I think there's a lot of things that we need to be thinking about within the communications realm that are going beyond just press releases. I don't write press releases, and they have a place, and they will continue to have a place, but there's a bigger thing out there. So, it is challenging. The climate is bad. I'm not going to get into the details of how much money is going to be taken out of the sector, where all those savings are coming from, but it's clear that there is a short amount of time to get to where we are now to 3.5 years' time in terms of some of the local government political cycles, to reduce our budgets by, on average, over, at a county level, I'd say between 100 and 150 million or something like that. And the sad thing is that a lot of those areas that will be impacted will be things that we all use, people-based services, the roads that we drive on, the street lights that potentially keep us safe as we walk down the street. And the challenge for us is, what do we do in terms of managing the engagement, tell that story about the challenge and taking the money out. We all accept that maybe we've spent too much money in the past, we've got massive debt. But that doesn't stop someone having a social care need. That doesn't stop my mother potentially needing social care in the future, or using public transport, or feeling safe walking down the street. Those things won't go away, but I think the method and the delivery and the response will have to change. So I'll put the Dire Straits thing there. I'm kind of, when I was growing up, it was one of the albums my dad used to play a lot of. And I tried to Photoshop. I'm not very good at Photoshop, hence the sketchnoting. I tried to do a kind of brothers in arms. I was actually trying to say, there, for me, that's about a symbolic, actually. Local government as a community, we need to come together, hold our, well, maybe it didn't work. But we are in dire straits, the perception is. But, as I say there is a huge opportunity for communication professionals across the sector. Not just the sector, actually, people who are interested in communications in other sectors, private sector, voluntary sector, and actually if you're just a nosy person in your community, there's a real opportunity for you to get involved. I checked just a minute ago on my iPad, because I've got these on there, that luckily I don't think these words were on the bingo, so I'm quite pleased about that. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about what these mean to us here in Devon. So prevention, I think managing demand and behaviour change. Now for me, this whole thing about the communications challenge is about accepting that there will likely be a model where we want to encourage people not to come to us at all. So it's not about channel shift, bingo there. It's not about channel shift, it's about literally shifting the responsibility onto the citizen to find and source help locally instead of coming to the local authority as the default option. So I was talking to Scott outside, Scott Burns, and he said it's kind of the citizen default approach. And actually in some ways it kind of is, but it kind of goes beyond that. In the sense that actually we still have a huge role to play in terms of providing public information, and there's a whole range, and I mentioned that there, my little head there saying public information is critical. Prevention has a spectrum. So at the moment we manage prevention in terms of just maybe stopping people fall off the cliff. And actually we need to take a few steps before that to preempt that walking towards the cliff. And then stages before that, which is actually preparing people to understand that cliffs are dangerous in the first place. So there's something about moving way back into the language and the communication to reframe what we're saying to people, to help them understand that actually there is something they can do locally themselves. And that might be go and ask a neighbour for a shovel to get rid of that snow in the driveway, as opposed to expecting the council to grit your road. Might be one of those scenarios. Managing demand, all of these things are fundamentally related, and they're all about essentially trying to ensure that services that are designed are user-driven. I don't know whether that was on the bingo. It's going to be on my head now for the next 20 minutes. But essentially, we need to use the prevention and the prepare approach to reduce the demand on services overall over a long term. We're not talking 4 years. We're talking what are we doing today with our 20, 30-year-olds that reduce demand on social care when they're 50, 60, 70. So there is a massive long-term gain. That is a real challenge to get that kind of long-term thinking really adopted, especially in a climate where we're in 4-year budget cycles. And actually, that approach doesn't necessarily take any money out of anyone's budget by the end of this financial year. So there is a massive challenge there around the kind of long-term managing demand agenda. Behaviour change. For me, this is the kind of biggest thing. If we want to do anything, we need to redefine the relationship with our citizens, with our users. We need to kind of create a new kind of social contract within communities that kind of create an environment where people feel that it's okay to ask for help from people within their own community. And actually it's okay to offer help for people within your community, as opposed to thinking it's a right, I pay council tax and therefore there must be a service I should be able to access. There's still going to be that, and I think there will be fundamental challenges in that whole kind of communication landscape. But essentially, that's some of the challenges we're going to have to face. In all of that, saying that, it might sound quite gloomy, but if you're really passionate about local services, this stuff is really, really exciting to get involved in. All of this stuff is about reimagining what those services look like, reimagining how we meet needs, and actually sometimes stepping away from it and allowing things to grow and emerge within local communities. And understanding that essentially what will remain is that there will still have to be some kind of safety net to make sure that people are protected, that children are safe and older people are safe. Social care is one area where the kind of public information agenda is kind of key. We have a mandate, there's a care bill that talks about the responsibility to ensure that people have access to good information and advice. Now, I kind of did a bit of an audit, I wouldn't say an audit, although we're here, a bit of a just look around local authority websites to see how people are approaching the kind of public information agenda, broadly speaking, around social care, and how access to services that provide information and advice on websites are delivered. We're not particularly very good at that, I'd say, as a sector, but I think, and you'll hear more about what Gov.uk have done, and I think there's a shift for us to think about how we really focus on user needs, not just assuming that someone turns up on a council's homepage and then starts there and navigates through some kind of glorious organisational structure, but actually it's about putting the user first, and the organisation actually is a kind of irrelevant in that point. If we have a role to play to provide public information, we will do it, and if we have a role to provide a service, we should do it, and if we have a clear role to provide information and advice that help people find services that are in their local community, we should do it. So some of the things that the principles for the provision of information and advice talk about, and I say they're reusable because actually if we can crack social care and get that kind of environment right, actually then that's the model for how our website should operate anyway, is that we should provide an environment where our websites are allowing people to access services, whether they're ours or whether our partners, or services within communities, all those voluntary kind of things, that we should be able to do that. But there's a whole load of things that we need to think about. So we need to be user and evidence-based. We really need to understand not just the need in terms of the information, but what the capacity is within areas in terms of what is the information we're providing. So the user need might be to access some services that reduce social isolation. Now, some of that might be best resolved by just connecting them to some local informal networks that meet in a local village hall or a local cafe and allow them to connect and reduce their social isolation. That's not anything we will directly fund or provide, but it's a mechanism for people to connect with those services. So that's something about being user-driven and evidence-based at all levels. And then the kind of thing about increasing awareness, we need to be clear about targeting, and this is for us where a platform like GovDelivery can really help us. People can sign up and be notified or be informed about stuff which is local, personalised and relevant to their needs at a point in time where they enter a transition into a service. So the key bit for us is to frame public information at the point at which someone really needs it. So they switch into the need for a service. So there's an opportunity there, and there's an opportunity as they come out of that service to think about what our messaging and our communication is in terms of to build capacity or encourage them to support other people in that area. We need to think about the kind of delivery approaches. This is the stuff luckily I did put digital by design, not by default. And I think from my point of view, from a local government perspective, we need to be open by default, and we need to be providing the platform for people to access stuff, not necessarily the service itself. An example of that is where if someone's phoning us up or using an online form to report that snow, essentially instead of having a form that says report blocked road for snow, there's a form that says how do I find someone who's got a shovel locally. So we're moving from a self-service environment to a self-help environment. So it's more about allowing people to connect to that capacity. And we have a scheme in Devon called Snow Wardens, where we have a load of people based at the parish town level who are identified snow wardens. So when there's a bunch of snow that falls down, they're responsible for clearing the paths. Our responsibility is to fill the grit bin. So we provide the infrastructure, they provide the service. And actually that's the kind of challenge we need to think about, is that's not going to work across all services, but there is a model there for us to think about how do we get that kind of similar scenario where we can provide the infrastructure to a point and then the community itself can use that infrastructure to deliver the services locally. I mentioned it being reusable. This is something, that picture on the right hand side is essentially, you can just about see at the bottom in the picture, 2 monitors. Now that's actually what I look at every day, is the kind of public, that's how I've mapped public information broadly in my head. And on the left hand side is how I see the user's journey, really. Crudely speaking, there's no real evidence for this at this point in time, but it's just how I picture it in my head. And a user starts outside of our organisation, as they generally would, and their need might be, how do I access a service of some kind? Or how do I find something out? So our responsibility, in some way, is to ensure that that information is available. Now that might be about us commissioning voluntary organisations to have that information available, or it might be that we provide that information ourselves. There is an assumption there that people will then drop straight through to delivering or to receiving a service, and that's not necessarily the case, because the big change is about that first top bit of the pyramid is actually what's the opportunity for us to push people back out of that pyramid, back into their local community to deliver services locally. If, however, they do need a service, they will get that service, and it will be the best kind of service we can do. It will be designed digitally, and there will be, and it is in there, it does say channel shift, and I apologise for that, but essentially it will be a shift in channel. We need to move away from thinking that we can keep all channels open. And there will be a point at which we need to be really honest and say that phone line that you used to rely on will no longer exist in 18 months' time. We need to make sure that whatever we're doing here, we have clear and well-articulated decommissioning strategies for existing channels. We can't afford to keep everything open, and we need to make sure that the aspiration is that actually self-help first, and then if they do, they can use the most effective service that we can design. Right at the bottom is where it kind of gets really complex, is real complex needs around in the social care and health agenda. I'm not going to say anything specific about that other than it's really, really hard. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't avoid it, it just means we should accept that it's really, really hard and it's not going to be solved overnight. But we should do the hard work. I'm a big advocate of the design principles that the Gov.uk team promote. And number 4 for me sticks in my mind: do the hard work to make it simple. Had a conversation with someone in the office the other day who wanted to spend £10,000 on a website, and I managed to persuade them not to have a website at all, because actually when they looked, all the information they wanted to provide on that website was already in place amongst the number of community websites they were hoping to target. So I just said, all you need to do is a bit of hard work to actually ensure that they've provided a consistent approach to that information. And he kind of looked at me, accepted that it was a harder approach, and the easy approach would have just been to commission a website and get it done. But actually just doing that little bit extra work made the big difference. And actually that model is about everything. So that's not just the kind of social care model, this is about everything that we're doing. And where you get those services and complex services, it's about designing services differently. So a kind of service design stuff. The other complex thing that we need to think about is actually, if we're talking about how we enable people to connect across communities, whether that's a community newsletter or whatever, or we want to move to a more digital environment, the big challenge for us is actually, in a rural county, we've still got some massive challenges around broadband and connectivity generally. So there is a lag for us. Our broadband programme isn't due to be completed until 2015, 2016, and that's only really to make sure that the 2 megabit connection is available at the box down the road, not necessarily going to guarantee that someone will take that up. So there's a communications challenge for us to ensure that there is a kind of demand stimulation process there, is encouraging people to actually desire or want that connectivity in the first place. And this is a framework that kind of developed collaboratively with a group of people, which is part of the local GovDigital network, which I'm the chair of. So it wasn't the communications network, Mark, unfortunately. It was the local GovDigital network, which is basically just a bunch of people who moaned on Twitter a couple of years ago, came together, and the LGA thought it was a really great idea to kind of help validate us. And we're now a kind of practitioner network who are just trying to share things and share good practice. But the whole idea around this framework is to say that if we want anything interesting to happen, which is the middle bit, we actually have to have some core capabilities in place first. Simple things like connectivity, have people got that? In places like Dartmoor, I was cycling up there the other day and there was no signal for at least probably 2 hours of that cycle. And which is a good thing. It's great to be on Dartmoor and not have a signal, but actually there are people who live there who we would potentially be alienating if everything was digital by default. So there's something about that assisted stuff. Education, actually, are people aware of how they use technology? Are they aware of how to use new computers? Everything's moving so fast, pretty much all computers will have a touchscreen element at some point. I know my mum's scared to hell of all this stuff. But she does know that at some point technology will help her kind of live a better life. She kind of first realised technology was an advantage when she got addicted to Farmville. As soon as they wanted money, she kind of pulled out quite quickly. But she was a really good advocate of Farmville for a while. But that allowed me to kind of explore the other benefits of access to the computer, like actually I could message her on Facebook while she was also on Farmville. And the next challenge was actually I could maybe stay in contact with her and she could see my children through the computer, although she only lives 2.5 miles away. So it was probably easy to get a public transport. Hardware and software really is a bit just about being open. Our software and our hardware and our platforms need to be open so that people can use them, so they don't have to spend huge amounts of money and they can create things themselves. We all, as public sector organisations, have lots of IT equipment which generally gets reused. I know we're reusing ours a lot more to kind of extend its life. But essentially there are stuff that organisations get rid of, and actually what's our responsibility to make sure that the people in our communities have access to good technology and hardware that doesn't have any long ongoing costs. And the last bit is participation. Even if all of those things above are true, are people actively participating in the internet to actually help improve their lives? I would argue my mum playing Farmville didn't do anything for her quality of life at all, other than that she had an allotment in her back garden that she failed to maintain during her Farmville addiction. And I know improving her quality of life would have been much better if she tended to her cabbage and carrots in the back garden and not the ones in the virtual space. But there's something about technology and the participation in technology which can reduce social isolation to a point. And we know within a public health agenda, actually isolation is a big factor and loneliness is a big factor in having poor quality of life. So all of those things are kind of the big agenda for us, and the global outcomes, crudely at a really simplistic level, are about improving people's lives, contributing to a climate where growth and well-being is something that we all kind of work towards. But if we want to do anything in the middle to get there, we need to make sure those things on the left are done, and that's about kind of negotiation, and comms generally aren't in the game of making sure people have connectivity, but we do have a role to make sure people understand the value of having connectivity, that they understand the value of learning about technology, that they understand the value of having access to software and hardware, whether it's a second-hand iPad from their kids or whatever, and actually the value of participating in the technology. And I think, just to kind of finish, the kind of big thing for me is that if we're not adding value as communication professionals, then what are we doing? Because at a crude level, we say to our teams in Devon, if you're not adding value, we can commission you. And if you add value, it's harder to commission that value somewhere else. So crudely speaking, a kind of a really somber moment. It's kind of this is exciting. It's a really interesting time to work in local government, but we've got to focus on the value that we create. And if we don't add that value, our communities are going to suffer. So thank you very much.
Alison over there.
Yeah, Alison Saunders, ONS. I'm intrigued about a bit about the user-centric services and evidence-based services. Can I just ask you what sort of internal challenges you've had to overcome to instill that culture of user-centric?
Yeah, I'm not saying we've solved that at all. I think in places, some parts of our organisation accept that actually focusing on the user need is the right thing to do. But we do have scenarios when, even though they believe that to be true, when you translate that into action in a web context or even some web pages, there's still a desire to reflect their service as it is now and to articulate themselves. So crudely speaking, what we're doing is we're saying you don't have a role in managing anything online. Your role is to deliver a service, and our role is to deliver the public information. And very much kind of inspired by the Gov.uk folks, is that their role is to just check that the policy context is correct and that it's all factually accurate. We need to champion the user, and I think at some point we need to work more with users and less with services. And I think that's the challenge, and we're really only just starting that process. But we're doing some work internally to just make sure that the teams who are supporting this process understand that as well. And that's a big cultural shift for us. But we're getting there. Yeah.
Carl, John Donovan from Foods. What are you doing to use this approach to work with your local studio partners and your district councils, health authorities and people like this? Because the citizen doesn't know where these services come from.
That's a really good question. I was in a meeting, what day are we today? Thursday? Tuesday. And talking about prevention and the prevention approach. And the conclusion of that meeting was that actually anything that we want to do is about that kind of broader, Devon, from our point of view, it's the Devon Strategic Partnership and the Local Enterprise Partnership. And we have a reasonably active Devon Strategic Partnership who are wanting to kind of move towards a different thing, and we're kind of just feeding this in as a kind of framework or a recipe kind of approach to say, actually, if we want to work differently, I think what we're finding is that strategic leaders generally don't know the answer. What they're asking for, and I think they're quite receptive right now to new ways of thinking. So I think that's why the kind of opportunity and the exciting time is that actually, as practitioners in this room, we've got an opportunity to shape that future. So we're just feeding that into the conversations, and there's enough people locally we've got, and we're involving a lot of people internally as well to make sure that actually we're talking from the same song sheet. So we're literally just feeding this up. So this is very current for us. So these slides really, although I kind of finished them for Friday, The reason they were kind of so broad was that I knew there's meetings going on right now which were actually about kind of tackling some of these agendas. The big challenge is that we've still got to square the fact that what we're trying to talk about is a wider, longer term strategic agenda, and people have still got to manage budgets on a year-to-year basis. And there's still a lot of kind of squaring that circle around actually how do we deliver value within year, and how do we then have a long-term agenda. So we're literally taking kind of twin track approaches and saying we need to do stuff now, and we need to put some stuff into place which is about long-term prevention and preparing people for the future, really.
District Borough Council in Suffolk. Does your leadership team include buy-in from your members, or are members your biggest educational need?
I'd say, and I'm not saying this because it's broadcast or anything like that, but to be honest, our members aren't a problem. I think we're fortunate in the sense that our members have taken a step back and just said, what we want is to have a completely different model of local government in Devon. And they're saying, they're passing the financial challenge to the council and saying, what does that look like? The commitment our leader has said is that every single one of our services will be fundamentally reviewed over the next 3.5 years, to the point where it's not about saying service X has to take a percentage cut. It's saying this service has these outcomes, it's targeted in this way, and here's the local need that it's meeting. How do we deliver that need and meet that need differently? That's a massive engagement program that we've started. It's also a massive communications challenge. But actually, on the whole, I don't think that they're a barrier. I think the barriers are just our own capability to think differently and to let go. I think that's the biggest barrier that I've come across, really, is people letting go of traditional models of delivering local service. And then that's kind of hooked up into the risk agenda.
Alison Stone from North Berkshire Homes, we're a housing association. Thinking about the users, and there's obviously certain members of the community that are quite resistant to going online. How are you approaching that? Is that with a carrot or with a stick?
Good question. I think, in all reality, I think we know, because of the situation in Devon in terms of connectivity, we're in a situation where our assisted channels, our local points of contact, whether they're our offices, whether they're other public sector offices, GP surgeries or libraries or citizens advice bureaus, etc., all of those still have a huge role to play for us in the public information agenda. Now, I'd be lying if I said our plan over time wasn't really about trying to retract some of that stuff and encourage people to go online. But if we're really driven by the users and we're attempting to kind of look at that wider framework, that decommissioning will have to be supported by capacity building within those people. So there's no explicit time frame, so it's a kind of bit of both, really. We need to provide support and education around how to use this stuff, but actually we do need to shut some existing channels down. Printed materials are a huge cost, and just even simple things like that, and just sending leaflets out, social care leaflets out to all of our GP surgeries and libraries is a huge cost for us. It's not massive compared to this whole social care agenda, but in terms of providing public information, it's something that we probably could move away from. But it will be a kind of decommissioning, capacity building coming in to replace it. Silence.
Any other questions? Time. Another one. There we go.
Oh, excellent. That's all right.
Hi, I'm Robert Harley. I work in independent freelancer with a number of local authorities. Your three-phrase slide about prevention, managing demand and behaviour change isn't the biggest area of behaviour change inside the organisation. And how does your role and work around digital commons reflect that back into the organisation? It's all very well, them out there have got to change, but we're all right.
Yeah.
It's such a default position anyway, and if people are feeling threatened because of cuts and job losses and all the rest of it, that becomes very much in that spot a bit of the box about the really hard stuff.
Yeah.
I totally agree. I think I didn't want to underplay the behaviour change challenge, to be honest. I think the challenge is there is a behaviour change one internally, but there's also a real practical implication for the teams who are working in these areas, because as we work with users and or services, the end result is that at some point a number of people or a proportion of people might not have a job as a result. That's a fact, that's a sensitive issue to manage. In terms of broadly kind of encouraging the thinking differently, one thing that we did and one thing that we're increasingly doing is we held a whole month in June called Create and Innovate. And it was literally just, we had our corporate leadership team engaged. We actually took their first meeting in June, moved them to the Met Office in Exeter, and they had their meeting at the Met Office. And then every meeting after that was very much differently positioned for them. And we held, we had a committee chamber taken over for the day, and we had TED videos playing. We had our libraries piloting social media surgeries and capacity building. And the whole proposition for that month was, how do you think differently about delivering services in the future? It was just a snapshot. It highlighted a whole range of new challenges moving forward, but the organisational internal narrative is about doing things differently, doing different things, and stop doing some things. And also, it's about engagement. So we had a staff briefing by our chief executive a few weeks ago, kind of an hour spent talking about the challenges of the organisation going forward. And the question I asked was, so what can we do as staff? And the response was, just get engaged, be part of shaping the future of the council. That isn't an easy challenge. We know that in local authorities there's still people, less so now, but there are still people who are still sat in the same office desk, in the same room, doing essentially the same thing as they did a few, maybe 10, 15 years ago. So there's still those kind of subtle barriers, but it's not an easy process, but we are looking at behaviour change externally and internally. But a lot of the pressure is coming, we want to kind of pull it out of the organisation. So we're trying to demand stuff on the outside and champion the user, and then kind of pull the organisation to change outside. But we are doing kind of a twin track approach again as well. But it's more subtle internally at this point in time.
Hi, it's Tom from Croydon Council. You said that the importance of being of having clear and articulated plans for decommissioning services. That's not very popular for residents and customers, but equally not very popular for members sort of politically. Have you got any tips on how you approach that?
Yes, not necessarily tips, but kind of the approach that we would advocate is that you can't decommission to nothing. There has to be something in its place. So it's about be clear about what that alternative is, whether that's a community-based service, whether it's a voluntary-driven service, and having that service promoted way in advance of the decommissioned service to encourage take-up and user involvement in the design of that service will actually result in the decommissioning maybe happening sooner than you anticipated. So it's not about saying we decommission to nothing. It's articulating, although in some cases the traditional model is actually we are decommissioning, so we won't be providing something. But the public information challenge is, how do people still access a service or a set of services that used to look like that? And that's about articulating and promoting that in that kind of cross curve. Is you promote the new service as you slowly decommission the other. But political buy-in around the whole thing is critical, and it has to be managed quite carefully. I don't think there's any secret recipe for that, because different organisations have political priorities, but all I would say is member involvement is key. And good negotiation skills, I guess. And communication skills, negotiation, assertive problem.
Still have a few more minutes if there are any questions.
Hi, it's Paul from Nottingham City Council. What's the most important digital initiative that you've put in place in the last 12 months?
That's a really good question. I would say it's probably about from an infrastructure point of view. We had legacy web content management stuff, kind of costing a huge amount of money and clunking at the sides and being out of support. So the biggest thing we did, I would say, is quite simple, but it's probably the thing I'm most proud of, if you kind of put it into that context, in terms of the team, is that we've created a new agile infrastructure that allows us within comms and the organisation to respond much quicker to those digital needs. So it's more about creating some of that infrastructure that allows the organisation to adapt quicker. Whereas before we had quite a legacy approach where things were done big, long term, and actually we're now doing things and doing them in more bite-sized chunks. Just if you just take a really simple analogy would be in terms of how we're approaching the migration of our content out of the old system into the new one. A while ago we would have done the whole thing in one big bang, but actually what we're now doing is doing small chunks based on that specific user need, and then moving that small chunk of content across, and then essentially shutting down the old stuff. As opposed to doing the whole lot and getting confused by multiple user needs, we're targeting within our adoption and fostering sites. We looked at the needs of people who wanted to adopt and people who wanted to foster, and focused on those needs and just did those two sites on their own, along with a whole range of other sites. So we just did things in manageable chunks. So I guess the key thing for us is that infrastructure, looking at how we can be more agile.
Looking at CD Gilliams from County City Council, looking at comms structures across councils, they obviously sort of differ. Do you think that communications, particularly web communications, sits centrally within councils, or do you think it should be devolved down to the lowest level, and that all your staff should be involved in some form of external communication within their because they're all like ambassadors for council and people like human faces rather than organisations?
I'd see that in two ways. One is from a website aspect. I wouldn't devolve content any further than a corporate team. My experience, and other people may have different experience, my experience is as soon as you devolve content at a website level into services, the quality of the content drastically reduces and turns very much into a self-promotion of that service. So you lose all the kind of user focus, and it's all about kind of project driven and stuff that doesn't make any sense. At a social level, so moving away from the website and looking at social platforms, then yeah, devolve a lot of that and build capacity. We did something where our highways control centre, we did a 24-hour Twitter challenge, promoted what the highways control centre did. The end result was that our highways control centre manager created his own Twitter account, started to manage our Devon Roads account, and now has the direct voice around our transport infrastructure. And our local media, specifically our kind of local BBC media, have kind of sent emails to our chief executive saying the kind of broadcast messages and the emergency information that's coming out through that channel has been fantastic. We wouldn't have been able to do that centrally. That's about devolving that, but in terms of the core public information message, my preference would be to control that in a kind of more centralised way.
So you write the whole big concept. So you write the entire content for the Devon folks?
That's the plan, is that that's the model we're in the process of adopting now, and we want to reduce the volume of the content, because as soon as you devolve, people don't suddenly find 30 additional pages of content which is meaningless, and you can easily get that down to one, and maybe an FAQ or a guide or something like that. So having that control and championing that user need from a web content point of view, my preference would be to kind of centralise that and then devolve the kind of social channels with capacity support and nurturing.
Hi, Rodri Jones from Swansea Council.
Hello.
I'm just interested in how you tackled the internal communication side of it. Obviously, in local governments, you've got such a diverse workforce. How you made sure that sort of down to the sort of the guys that are out working on the streets sort of are getting signed up to the sort of digital vision, as it were?
I'm not entirely convinced we have solved that internal challenge around digital, I think, and in some ways I'm not overly concerned that, broadly speaking, most people don't understand the digital agenda. I'm not overly concerned by that, in the sense that the key bit for me is that they're clear about the outcomes they're trying to deliver, and some of the outcomes might require no technology whatsoever. So I think, just like any technology or IT-driven agenda, if you go there and try and make people think about technology, they'll invent a technology solution where there quite clearly isn't the need for one. So there are people who are capable of understanding technology, and it's about putting them in the right space with people who do, and who understand what the service demands are. And I think just having that mix is a far healthier environment to get into, and I think if the result is a digital platform, then they'll grow and understand the opportunity of that digital platform as a valuable resource, not as a barrier. Most people's perception of IT is that Outlook crashes or they can't log in on a day-to-day basis, so to talk about what Google Glass or personal data stores might do for them is just completely away from their mind. And I think the organisation pays people to think about that. I'm one of those people, so it's about having those conversations at the right time with the right people, really, and saying if technology is part of this solution, then let's do the best that we can do.